Good afternoon, everyone from Manila, and a very warm welcome to today's Green Road webinar. Now, today's event is part of an ADB series, which discusses cross-cutting dimensions on decarbonisation, climate resilience, water management, biodiversity, disaster risk reduction, construction materials, and inclusive growth for developing green roads. These webinars are anchored in ADB's recently published Green Roads Toolkit and Assessment Tool. It's a very good resource. I hope you'll check it out. And today's webinar is going to hone in specifically on the topic of advances in disaster preparedness for transport and communities. I'm Belinda Hewitt. I'm a Senior Disaster Risk Management Specialist with ADB's Climate Change and Sustainable Development Department. And it's a real pleasure today to host the session on behalf of ADB's Transport Sector Office. So I'd like to briefly introduce the House rules for today. Now, your microphones will remain muted unless you're invited to speak. However, we do really welcome your inputs. So we'd love you to use the Q&A function in Zoom and just post your question in there if you'd like to raise one for the speakers. After the speakers have done their presentations, we'll pick up on the key questions and share them with the speakers for their feedback. Now, I'm delighted that we have two very exciting presentations to share today and some fantastic lineup of speakers. We have firstly Alexandra Howard from the Phoenix, Australia, who will present on applying a trauma-informed approach to disasters. And then next we have Professor Russell Thompson from the University of Melbourne, who will present more broadly on increasing the resilience of transport networks. However, before we dive into these presentations, I'd first like to welcome Alexander Babanen, who is a Professor of Ocean Engineering with the University of Melbourne. And Alexander's going to provide us some sort of scene-setting remarks for today's session. Over to you, Alexander.
Thank you, Belinda, and thank you, Ian, Michael, Mark, for organizing this seminar, webinar, where CDMPS can show some of our research results. CDMPS is the Center for Disaster Management and Public Safety at the University of Melbourne. Cross faculty, it has a number of priority areas and 10 research units which cover all aspects of the disasters, from understanding the disasters through engineering aspects such as transport and infrastructure and food security, to social and mental health issues. And you presented our speakers today is our two leading professors. And of course, the topic of your webinar series, and particularly the advances in disaster preparedness for transport and communities, are very topical for us as well, because transport and community issues, they are relevant for any disaster, whether it's an earthquake or flood or bushfire or tsunami. All right, so it's very general, very universal, important topic to understand and research. And over to you, Belinda, to this exciting seminar.
Thank you so much, Alexander, for those initial words. Very good way to start the session. So without further delay, let's introduce our first speaker. Please welcome Alexandra Howard. Alexandra is Director of Disaster and Public Health Emergencies at Phoenix, Australia Centre for Post-Traumatic Mental Health. Alexandra is a clinical psychologist and public health practitioner who has worked in the field of disaster and post-traumatic mental health for more than 15 years. So over to you, Alexandra.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. As Alex said, it's great to be able to be part of this webinar series. So today I'll just jump straight in. So I'll be looking at maybe a slightly different tact to possibly what some of the other webinar topics have been on, and looking at applying or asking you to consider applying a trauma-informed approach to disaster, whatever it is your role in disaster is. So as Belinda mentioned, I'm from Phoenix, Australia. So we're a non-for-profit that sits within the University of Melbourne. And our mission is really around understanding trauma and renewing lives. So always good to be able to share this information. So as I'm sure you're all aware, there are many broad impacts of disaster, whatever that disaster might be. So we take an all hazards approach. And you may be looking at this diagram thinking, okay, well, I mostly work within the built environment, or maybe the built and the natural, with a kind of looking at the impacts on economic. But as you can see, they really intersect across all areas. So today I'll be focused on more the three top ones. So thinking about, well, what are the human psychosocial impacts that we know about disaster in the community, and the social ones. But the reason I want to present it like this is because if we can make headway, or if we can build resilience in one of these areas, or reduce the impacts in one of these areas, then the chances is that we will influence other areas as well. So it's a really important to take that whole of sector, that whole of organization and system approach. So I'm going to start first by going over some pretty well established facts and evidence that we know from the field of post-traumatic mental health about what the impacts are at an individual and community level. And I'll probably pause for a moment for you to be able to think about, well, what does this mean for me? What does this information mean for me in the role that I have, that will look nothing like a mental health specialist, such as my role. And then I'll introduce very briefly what we consider to be a trauma-informed approach and what that means, and hopefully get you to start thinking about, well, what would that mean for your organization and for your role? So we know that after a potentially traumatic event, such as a disaster, an individual can experience a whole range of impacts. And we often refer to this collection as the fight, flight, freeze response. So you will probably have identified this in yourself if you're feeling very stressed, that your heart might be racing, or you'll have difficulty concentrating, or have intrusive thoughts or memory. You'll have a whole range of emotions. The way that you behave will be impacted by that traumatic event or that disaster. So maybe avoiding things, maybe increased conflict within communities, we know is a big issue. Maybe increasing substance use, which obviously has flow-on effects to how people engage within a community, and risks that are involved, and then a lot of physiological reactions as well within the body. So the good news is that most people do recover from these initial common short-term reactions, but there are still a significant minority that go on to develop longer term, more entrenched problems as a result of a disaster. Some of that will look like a mental health condition, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, but it can look much broader than that. And I guess this is getting you to think then about, well, how might I be seeing this in engaging communities and public? So these issues can involve difficulty maintaining interpersonal relationships, splitting within the community, difficulties maintaining employment, so financial stress, and we know, unfortunately, existing disadvantage within that community. So just being really aware that there will be a greater divide really between the haves and have-nots as a result of the disaster. So there's a lot of data to back up this idea. Most people do recover. So if we look at that graph, this is probably one of the most commonly pulled out graphs in the field of post-traumatic mental health, and that is that most people recover or are resilient. But there are a group of people that the impacts of disaster may be delayed or chronic. So they may develop issues that without getting the appropriate help won't resolve themselves. So that's really important for you to have an awareness of in terms of the idea that impacts of disaster change over time. People who may look in communities who may initially be going well won't necessarily be going well 6, 12 months down the track. So the importance of monitoring, really important to acknowledge that even along any of those trajectories of long-term impacts of trauma, that there is the opportunity for something that we consider in the field of post-traumatic growth as well. So if we drill down a little bit into these, Newman and her colleagues from Western Australia have conducted a really great meta-analysis looking at some of the long-term symptom trajectory. So what is it that we're actually still seeing after there being impacts, and seeing that depression and anxiety seem to be still particularly problematic even 2 years after a disaster, and the rates are higher among children and adolescents. So thinking about the role of family there. And once again, this is looking across all disasters. They did find that the mental health outcomes related to earthquakes and pandemics had high prevalences of post-traumatic stress, but these findings are general across disasters. So what does this mean, firstly, in the current world that we live in, which is a world of multiple events or multiple disasters, or in the field, I've heard the term permacrisis. So that idea of going from one disaster to another, what impact does that have on systems, on infrastructure, on communities, and how they all interact together? And I think really acknowledging that that is the norm, not the exception now, thinking about, you know, a lot of the research comes from single events, and I suspect that's the same in other fields, not just mental health. So what does it mean when we overlay, you know, we put a pandemic on top of a disaster? What does that mean, not just for mental health, but for recovery in terms of built environment, natural environment, and other things like that? So just being aware of that really complex and unstable impact that those will have. Really important to emphasize that those groups already marginalized in the context of multiple events will continue to become further marginalized unless there's active efforts to counter that. One of the greatest predictors of recovery from disaster in terms of psychosocial outcomes is connectedness. And we think about this really in terms of social and community connectedness, but I think I wanted to include that here, given the theme of the webinar, that, you know, practical barriers to connectedness, to, you know, communities feeling supported with help coming in, aid coming in. Of course, the field that you work in is really critical to promoting that sense of connectedness. So this is, I guess, the first pause point for you. And you can just ponder this yourself and I'll continue on. But really having you think about, well, what does this information about the impacts of disaster mean for your role or your organization? Are you likely to interact with individuals immediately after a disaster where they have some of those short-term impacts? Are you looking at people? I'll just turn my camera off for a little bit. Are you looking at people at a community level, 6 months, a year down the track? And what might that mean? What does this mean for how people engage when you go out to communities to rebuild infrastructure, to get supply lines open again? What does that happen? And then also, what does it mean at a systems level or a government level when you think about those various impacts? And if we just take as an example, if we were thinking of individuals, you know, it's facing some aggression and irritability, people having difficulty explaining their situation or what their pressing needs are, difficulty following instructions, following guidance, you know, adhering to warnings, things like that, disorganization and forgetfulness. So thinking about whether this is something that you deal with in terms of community members or the staff that you send out to support these areas, these are the kinds of things that we might be expecting to see. So yeah, certainly you're welcome to put something in the chat, but otherwise, you know, take that as a moment just to pause and think about, well, you know, I've said all of this information, but what does it actually mean for you? Thankfully, there are some models of guidance around what we can do to support the wellbeing, both internationally and nationally. So I've given the Australian framework there as an example, but we do have the UN-related guidance. And if you see there in basic services and security, that would be a really key part that you play in terms of managing the psychosocial impact. So I do like this framework because it does include everyone, every organization that is working around disaster. That the idea is that they have a role, not to become a counselor, but there is a role that they play in terms of managing psychosocial impacts. And being trauma-informed, I think, can go across all of those different levels. So what do I mean by trauma-informed? Trauma-informed care, there are lots of definitions, but we generally consider it a strengths-based approach that has an understanding of the impacts of trauma, just like I've been through. And it thinks about both the providers, so both the staff, the supporters in terms of a disaster, and also in terms of the survivors or the people impacted by the disaster. And it's really about everyone has a role in creating an environment, a physical, a psychological environment that is supportive of recovery. So it will look different for what everyone does. So it's about minimizing those trauma-related barriers to accessing and engaging with you, with your organization, minimizes potential harm, and kind of supports the people working in the sector. So this is what we consider to be the principles of trauma-informed care. And I'll go through each of these and just give some examples of what this might look like for you, and once again, encourage you to also think about those. So the idea of being trauma-informed is that someone like myself as a psychologist can be trauma-informed in the work that I do, but anyone interacting or any organization or any system, you know, that could be gathering information about what has happened, all of those things can take a trauma-informed lens. And it often doesn't involve necessarily a lot of changes, a lot of procedural changes, but it is something worth, I guess, checking your procedures and your practices against. So, as I say, the challenge then is to think about, well, how can your organization promote each of these principles through your policies, procedures, through what staff capabilities you might need, how can they promote it whenever you're interacting with other organizations, with communities as a whole, or with individuals. So if we've spoken a little bit about being trauma aware, but if we think then about this could be thinking about within your mission or within your values, articulating that, you know, a lot of the people that you engage with are impacted by trauma, and also understanding that working in the disaster sector is one that is likely to cause great stress and strain for worker well-being. So that could be a way of showing that you're trauma-informed. In terms of building safety and trust, that's another one. I mean, obviously there's physical safety, which you have a really important role in, but psychosocial safety is really important as well. So thinking about how can you modify policies so that they're less likely to replicate aspects of the traumatic experience. Focusing on strengths. So this is probably implicit in when you do a needs analysis to help figure out what are the priorities, but being really clear that, you know, a community does come with its strengths and resources, and your work and your role is building on these and continuing to consult with the community. Facilitating connections I spoke about earlier, but that's one of the principles also of trauma-informed care. So this could be coordinating and collaborating with others in the region across multiple domains. So not just coordinating with other like organizations, but taking that kind of multidisciplinary approach like we do in the center to look at how can we be trauma-informed and connecting things. And having an awareness of how you can be connecting people in the community with other organizations to get their needs met. A really key part of being trauma-informed is to have a belief in recovery. Recovery is complex. It can take a long time for some. We do know that most people do recover, but having that at the core of when you go in to support communities in the immediate or long term after a disaster is really key. And then finally, giving choice and control is another core principle of being trauma-informed. So an example of that might be thinking about, well, how can we engage the communities that we work with and support to design the work that we do, design the environments that we rebuild, and also look at involving them in the evaluation of it. So in summary, hopefully I've given you a little bit of food for thought to take back to your usual roles, but we need to understand that continued exposure to adversity, trauma, and disaster is increasingly the norm, not the expectation. So updating our models to be that. We know there's a lot of evidence that in terms of psychosocial impacts, we're looking at 10+ years, and that isn't even taking into account the impact of compounding and multiple disasters. Hopefully I've given you something to think about in what trauma-informed might look like, or how broadly it can be applied. I do believe it has a role in all aspects of disaster across all sectors that work within the field of disaster. And the idea of trauma-informed practice is that it benefits the individuals, the communities, and your staff well-being. So the idea is that it does help with getting your organization's goals met. And one thing that you could do if you wanted to look into this more is think about, and obviously there's a lot more that can be said about each of these principles, but even at this higher level, thinking about, well, what are the opportunities for promoting these principles, whether they be big or small changes, just to continually have these in your mind to think about, could we do this in a way that better promotes a trauma-informed approach? And I've got some resources available, but they'll be in the slide pack. So I'll pause there and hand over either back to you, Belinda.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Alexandra. I think that was a really unique and fresh perspective on connectedness and the way we view connectedness in ADVs, and our clients. So really useful to think more broadly about how we build that social resilience in our transport projects, especially in the post-disaster context. I think it's very well aligned with our views on taking very participative and empowering approaches with our stakeholders. So thanks for that. Just a reminder, everyone, please post your questions and comments in the chat, the Q&A bar, and we'll get to those after the next speaker. So our second presenter is Professor Russell Thompson from the Department of Infrastructure Engineering at the University of Melbourne. Russell's research interests are in freight and logistics, transport network modelling, and post-disaster humanitarian logistics. So Russell, the floor is yours. You're just on mute, Russell.
Thank you very much. It's a great honour and privilege to present to this seminar series. I'm going to be talking about something quite different, and that is the more physical aspect of disaster and impacts on the transport networks. And so I'll be running through some principles that are aligned to our research and past research and ongoing research in terms of how we can make our transport networks more resilient. And so I'll be looking at some high-level concepts. There's a lot of technical sort of underpinning of this work, but I think it's appropriate. I'll provide some references there, but just to highlight the concepts and the approaches that we believe are very important for trying to improve the resilience of transport networks. So we have a number of problems that we address in transport networks. We know that the frequency and the occurrence and the intensity of natural disasters is increasing, and this is presenting lots of challenges as we try and restore and protect and to allow our transport networks to function, particularly after the event of disasters. So we know that there's lots of impacts, and these relate to a lot of social economic impacts when our transport networks are affected or disrupted, and this can be very severe on our communities and economic systems. Our government has identified that flooding, even in Australia, is a very expensive disaster, and so over $8 billion per year. And this is increasing. So this is huge cost of restoring and repairing and restoring these networks. So we've certainly got a lot of ongoing work to do to try and improve the resilience of our transport networks. And graphically, yeah, look, we can see a lot of our pavements, our road pavements, our infrastructure, and social and community impacts are directly related to these extreme weather events where we get huge downpours of rainfall. And so that's important that we do get a lot of damage, and this is quite problematic for the functionality of our road networks. And so we've had lots of inquiries and lots of discussion, and I just wanted to highlight some of the themes coming through in terms of, as a researcher who's involved in transport network design and modelling, how we can relate to this. So there's been lots of different inquiries. A Royal Commission recently talking about the need for more mitigation, preparation, response, and recovery. And lots of work here to be done to understand this more, to be able to predict the effects, to be able to approach this in a bit more of a systematic and a scientific way. And so one of the outcomes and recommendations was that we really should focus on how we can use technology, how we can use our tools and systems, obviously, to try and improve resilience from these very important natural hazards that we have and are experiencing more frequently. So we certainly need to provide information. So as engineers, we provide a number of tools, we provide information, and this is very important as researchers. We develop approaches which can improve decision support for transport network managers, particularly, and planners that are responsible for operating and improving our road networks. The emphasis on mitigation, I'd like to emphasize, because this one is quite neglected. We see a lot of attention after the disaster event, but it's really before that we have a lot of opportunity to reduce the impacts and increase resilience. And also the resourcing ongoing is very important, that we'd certainly like to highlight as a very important aspect associated with improving network resilience. And so, yes, we certainly have lots of room for improvement and improvement in designing tools to provide that ongoing mitigation aspect, which can involve works, strengthening works done prior to these extreme events to minimize and reduce the impact of these extreme weather events. And so this involves trying to develop investment programs and to identify the appropriate elements of the network, the appropriate treatments, that this can be done pre-disaster, pre-extreme event, and this can have considerable benefits for reducing the impact of disasters on our physical transport networks. So the real need for research in this area is relating to that there's a lot of investment and a lot of expenditure after disasters, but we look at this as a holistic, that the whole disaster management cycle from first of all recovery, but obviously mitigation and preparedness is very much an important part if we're looking at this total expenditure, because after the event it's certainly important and necessary, but the expenditure can be considerable, and we promote a more holistic and a more medium to long-term approach, which looks at trying to identify and improve the resilience of road networks, particularly pre-disaster. And so we certainly look at how we can develop road and project schedules for mitigation. We look at traffic management associated with the immediately following a disaster. We can minimize the effect of the disaster by appropriate and improved traffic management plans. And we can also look at how we can design recovery work schedules that reduce the time that the network and the order of effect of these disaster events. So we certainly look at a more network, as I said, a more total disaster management approach to how we handle and how we prepare and how we can improve resilience for transport infrastructure. So just looking at how this might pan out, that pre-disaster we have opportunities for looking at how we can add links, we can get more redundancy in the network. We can also reduce vulnerability by increasing capacity on certain elements of our network, and we can retrofit in terms of strengthening vulnerable infrastructure, and this is very important pre-disaster in a mitigation phase, that we can do these activities. And of course, modeling tools that we are involved in can help identify the appropriate links and capacity and facilities to strengthen. And then we can also pre-position resources with some knowledge about the likelihoods of disaster events occurring in certain areas, in certain elements of our network. And of course, after the disaster, in the recovery phase, we can certainly look at how we can develop optimal schedules for restoring and reconstructing these networks. And this can all be done quite often in advance of the disasters. So we know with disruption from a disaster in terms of the physical impact on our transport networks, there's a number of factors. And so these schedules that our models are producing provide some guidance to try and minimize that disruption. We have a hazard, and we know that there are certain things we can do, mitigation in advance, recovery at the time, and then we can also look at how we can manage the traffic network better immediately following disasters. And so we know that these schedules, these solutions to quite complex mathematical and network-based problems are very important for minimizing this total disruption. And we know that obviously it requires resources. It requires us examining a broad range of options that are available. And but this is very important, that this comprehensive approach to 3 different types of schedules that can be developed based on the resources we have, based on predictions, based on the resources that we have for addressing the mitigation, the recovery and diversion aspects associated with transport networks. This curve, these resilience curves, are very important to understand the potential for these models, for these schedules to improve performance, because this graph shows that when the disaster occurs, there can be a dramatic drop in reduction in terms of functionality of our road networks particularly. And we can see that on the right-hand side, we have different options available to us to minimize the initial shock, the initial reduction, and also the recovery time, the time it takes to actually fully restore the network to a reasonable state. And so we know that the timing, the advanced mitigation works can reduce that initial shock, this initial dramatic effect, reduced functionality. And we know that there are other responses we can do that can actually aid in preparation to reduce this total effect in terms of a curve over time, this impact on our physical transport networks. And just to highlight that this difference between what could happen if there was no mitigation or strengthening versus what would happen if we did improve and look at some mitigation works, some improvements, some strengthening in advance, we do actually reduce not only the initial shock, but we create benefits in terms of that difference, in terms of performance over time, and we certainly can improve resilience dramatically by approaching this and introducing some of these works. And in economic sense, we have what happens quite commonly is that after a disaster event, in terms of time, we have massive expenditure in terms of reconstruction, and we also have quite significant disruption effect in terms of the traffic and the performance of the road network. So we have sort of 2 major shocks on the system: the shock of having to produce a huge amount of expenditure and reconstruction work. We also have huge impacts on road users. And so this is a typical situation where there's minimal strengthening and minimal treatment in advance. So if we look at the contrast, if we do a more constrained, more moderate and a more ongoing mitigation works in advance, so before the disaster, obviously this requires some expenditure, but obviously less impacts, less reconstruction costs after the event, but also less disruption to the road users and communities and economics of these communities once the disasters occurred. So we've developed a range of models which allow us to look at a network in terms of vulnerability initially, and the disaster events, and then look at how the transport networks are affected or potentially affected in terms of the traffic flows. And then we look at how we can develop these tools to help us identify the appropriate mitigation, reconstruction, but also diversion schedules that we've talked about that can actually reduce that overall disruption and provide an optimal schedule of these events. So a more systematic, a more holistic, network-wide, but looking at the economics, looking at the timing, and doing this in a systematic way. We believe this can really help reduce the impact, the disruption, but also improve resilience. So a lot of this has to do with the transport modeling, and in effect, we try to identify links which are where the network is vulnerable, where these are critical links, critical infrastructure that we know that should be protected, and we can do this well in advance of any disaster or the extreme weather event. And so we have tools which allow us to do that by identifying and looking at removing links and isolating links to look at just what links are critical and would have a major effect if they were actually impacted by a disaster. And then we look at how we could protect the network by enhancing these, and we can minimize disruption by protection, by strengthening, by upgrading the standards, by improving the conditions to help withstand these future disaster impacts. And then we look at traffic guidance immediately following a disaster event, damage. If we look at trying to divert traffic around and still try to provide functionality in the network, but to do this in a systematic, coordinated way, so the flow is maintained. And then, of course, recovery. This is very much an important area to restore the network. So the physical projects, the identification of the critical projects, critical links and infrastructure to provide that restoration involves looking at different types of vehicles and looking at the effects of improving and restoring different elements of the networks in a different time schedule. And so vulnerability analysis we've seen is looking at the potential of various elements of the network to actually reduce the performance of that. And so of course, in flooding and transport, we have lots of issues associated with drainage and which transport facilities we focus on. Then we look at the hazard prediction. We look at historical information based on scenarios of events that are more likely to occur, and combine these together with transport modeling, which looks at the allocation of vehicles to the network and the way that the users would use the network in terms of what routes and links are highly used. So we do this by understanding and in considering the origins and destinations from our transport demand. And again, this is well known in advance, can be done. And we look at both personal travel, passenger vehicles, as well as freight vehicles, which are very important for our economy. Some work we did with the World Bank was looking at an integrated set of models again to look at helping us identify potential for strengthening, for doing mitigation works well in advance of these disasters, by looking at the disasters events, by looking at the expenditure that could be undertaken, and in terms of and how that affects recovery, particularly looking at freight in this case. We're looking at the supply chains, the ability of goods to be able to service communities and urban areas in this case. And we looked at a scenario-based approach where a gaming type situation was presented to politicians to make decisions based on different levels of decisions. So we're able to predict the economic effect, the functionality effects of different events based on different scenarios of damage, recovery, and economic demand. And so this was an integrated approach again, which we try and promote for trying to understand how we can improve the total resilience of a transport network. And then we look at traffic management. After the disaster event, we have a series of decisions that typically we need to make in terms of how we restrict access around and within the affected areas. And so we looked at if we don't manage the traffic, what happens is that people approach these areas and are actually very congested, lots of disruption by traffic getting too close, if you like, to the areas and to the links that and facilities that are being disrupted. And so we developed a hierarchy of looking at a zone immediately outside the affected area and managing the traffic within that intermediate zone, this cordon, which allows us to look at how we can manage and even close off roads which are not directly affected, but certainly have an effect on the flow patterns if we allow traffic to move too close and within certain areas. This can be quite disruptive. And finally, we're looking at how we can use emerging technologies, information and modeling technologies. And this concept of digital twins is the one that we are promoting in terms of a more holistic approach to integrating the data required for modeling to improve resilience of transport networks, but also looking at how we can combine information infrastructure and communication infrastructure to provide an interactive planning tools that can improve transport resilience. And so with predictive tools now that we, with AI and lots of our data, we can actually in advance predict the hazards, the effect, the damage, and this can be done using quite sophisticated models. And so we can combine predictive models, particularly with the climate change, with the ongoing flooding and the prediction of floods, and also how that affects the physical traffic networks. And we use agent-based modeling, which looks at different interactions between the different players, the different types of road users, infrastructure managers, and how these decisions can be more integrated, particularly when we're looking at mitigation, response, and recovery. And we're also looking at just how we can assess these impacts using sensor technologies, because now we have lots of real-time information possible, using advanced sensors and even drones to bring back up-to-date dynamic information, real-time information about conditions of road networks, the damage, and this can be fed directly into these recovery and restoration models, which can improve, and diversion models, which can improve and lessen the impact of these disasters. And so we can look at what links we should be closing, and what sort of capacity reduction information that we can provide. And of course, as I said, with real-time monitoring now, these networks can be more integrated in terms of the response and the recovery. And we can also find out the status of our recovery works in terms of the performance of our system. The physical damage can also be assessed. And diversion management practices can be embraced by using such a digital twin, which integrates a range of models, integrates lots of different types of data, provides that ongoing interaction between tools which need to work in integrated way to improve and enhance this resilience. And so with the digital twin, this is very important to realize we have a real-world system, which is very complex, a physical system here, but lots of human users as well who need to interact. But we have models which have got limited information, but are based on data. And now we can supplement the historical data with dynamic data, and we can start to use AI-based techniques which can provide a more predictive and more prescriptive approach to help us manage in advance, but also during and after these disaster events. So this integrated framework is very promising in terms of providing huge opportunities to improve resilience for our physical transport network. And so I'll also provide some references to our research, but very happy to have some discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Russell. That was a very, I think, fascinating big picture view of some of the tools and the evidence for combining very context-specific approaches for risk reduction and preparedness and response for transport systems. And that balance is very much in line with ADB's Disaster Risk Management Action Plan, which is coming out in the next couple of months. Fantastic. So we'll now open up to Q&A. And I would encourage you to post your questions in the chat bar. But I'm just going to start with a general question for the two speakers. We've talked quite a bit, particularly in Russell's presentation, about restoring and reconstruction. So how do we best weigh up and implement a decision where it may actually not be appropriate to reinstate a transport asset after a disaster, perhaps due to very high hazard levels? Both interested from a psychosocial perspective from Alexandra, and then from a modelling or decision-making perspective from Russell. Thanks. Alexandra, perhaps you could go first.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great example of thinking about, well, what does this look like in practice to take that trauma lens? And I think, you know, ultimately, you know, decisions such as the one that you described are coming from different data sources, and the decision itself needs to be driven by that. But then it's thinking about, well, if that is the decision, how can we implement that in a way that isn't it will obviously add stress, but isn't adding kind of as much stress as it could. So I think it would be things around the way that you communicate, the consultation with the group, you know, leading time for the changes, ensuring that there is, you know, psychosocial safety, not just physical safety, is taken into account. So thinking about where you know, what impacts that might have on communities and connectedness, just really understanding those. And then, you know, even if you need to take up that, not rebuild that transport asset, you've looked at, well, what was this serving in terms of the community resilience and psychosocial impacts, and thinking about ways to replace those. But yeah, it's an interesting question. I'll pass to Russell for his perspective.
Sorry, you're on mute, Russell.
So yes, thank you. I think it's really important to assess the sort of obviously the safety and functionality, but obviously engineering is a very important part of this. But I think what happens is, as I said, the emphasis now is to try and understand the economics of these different facilities and infrastructure, and the effect that can have on that, and prioritize that in a more systematic way, and without the emotion and without sort of maybe, you know, just this ad hoc response. So we have the tools to do that. And I just want to emphasize that sort of network approach is very important. I think communities will accept if this is done in a rigorous, systematic way, that the confidence that this is actually the right thing to do. It may impact some people more, but I think it's that sort of having the confidence that these tools can do this in a holistic way, providing the broader benefits, I think is very important.
Thanks so much. Yeah, both really important perspectives. Okay, I've got two audience questions, and the first, I'm going to read both. The first one, Russell, is for you, and then the second one, perhaps Alexander and Alexandra can both come in on. So the first one, and this is from John Lamb, who's joined us. John's the UK Chair of Highways, Adaptation and Climate Resilience. So thank you so much, John, for joining the call. He was emphasising, Russell, that the point you made on facilities, strengthening facilities is really important. And do you have any specific case studies around where this has been successful or not done?
Certainly in the work that I was involved in earthquake disasters in Japan, very important work they do with strengthening the bridges, particularly in obviously to withstand certain forces from earthquakes, and certainly that's been a very sort of a very enlightening and a very successful story in terms of how they can in advance look at very simple treatments in some respects, but just identify the structures, identify very cost-effective measures to be able to strengthen facilities that when the earthquakes come, that they can withstand the impacts, and so yeah, look, I think it's mainly in a Japanese situation I'm familiar with, lots of very good work done ongoingly, because they live with these threats and risks quite continuously. But I think we can adapt that to things like flooding. We can adapt that to things like climate change events, because in that extreme situation where the earthquakes occur reasonably frequently, but there's some predictability about the magnitude, to actually do this strengthening in a systematic way we can apply the same concept to say urban flooding or regional flooding, because we've got quite historic information, and really we have got the tools, and just to have that sort of mentality and commitment to an ongoing strengthening program, I think is where I've seen in Japan. It's been really very, very successfully applied.
Fantastic. Thank you. So the second audience question, and just if you could each just take 30 seconds to 1 minute each, because I do have to wrap up by the hour, is from Safika Rahman. Apologies if I've mispronounced your name. On what are the various roles that universities may play in enhancing community level disaster resilience, particularly with the involvement of students from diverse international backgrounds? And whichever of you would like to go first, or if only one of you wants to answer, that's also fine. Alexander or Alexandra.
Maybe I'll go first because I will be very quick. I want to leave more time for Alex to answer. Obviously, we are the university center, right? And the university, apart from research, also does teaching and training. And that's how we can contribute into preparation of the future disaster managers, right? And I could talk more about that, but we have 2 minutes left. Alex, over to you.
I think just to add that, not only in terms of teaching and being more conscious about taking a transdisciplinary approach, listening to Russell, thinking about, I think there's some kind of modeling that you do there that we could learn from in terms of applied to a very different situation, but in terms of modeling for mental health and things as well. So I think that's a key part. And we also know universities are a really key point of connectedness. So it has a really key point after a disaster as well.
Thank you so much. Those are, I think, really good answers. So all that's left is for me to say a big thanks to our presenters and panelists today. I think these were really valuable and diverse insights on this issue of disaster preparedness for the transport sector. Now, all of the presentations will be uploaded to the Development Asia website for the Green Roads webinar series. I believe we've parked the link to that in the chat, so please do check it out. And I'm excited to share that the next Green Roads webinar will be held on the 15th of August. So please tune in then. And I believe we're going to close the session by bringing that topic up on screen. So once again, thanks to all of our presenters and wishing you a good day.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.